Grammar and reading comprehension are integrally intertwined with one another. This relationship becomes very complex for students with hearing loss because many are dealing either with an impoverished language base and/or are negotiating between two or more language modes. The objectives of this presentation are to examine the relationship between grammar and reading, because better language users are better readers and vice versa. To examine the relationship between grammar and reading in children who are struggling readers, because this information may provide us with some insights into the needs of deaf and hard of hearing children. To list available grammar-based assessments that inform language and literacy, because there is much confusion about how we should assess and what we should assess, and to consider basic grammar strategies that may promote reading comprehension, because the teacher can never have too many strategies and interventions from which to choose. Before we start, I'd like to clarify what I'm going to be talking about. This discussion is about grammar in particular, not language in general. Language refers to the thoughts we say to ourselves and others, and includes topics such as vocabulary, grammar, inferences, innuendos, tone of voice, and the different ways of conveying them, including printed, signed, and spoken forms. In other words, it refers to any of the codes by which humans communicate for the purpose of manipulating and/or sharing their thoughts with others. In this session, I'm speaking strictly about grammar, which comprises morphology, syntax, and to a certain degree, function words. I am also not talking about a metalinguistic understanding of grammar, but about the grammar we use in face-to-face conversations. For example, in the sentence, "that she was a new student was obvious to all," the first part, "that she was a new student," is called a noun clause. The term noun clause is a metalinguistic label. I'm not talking about labels here. That's what grade teachers do in their language arts classes. I'm talking about the fundamental, primary, underlying competence to understand what a person means when he says that she was a new student. Let's start with a discussion of the components of syntax. The topic of syntax usually sends most people screaming out the door because it can be very complicated very fast. During the decades of the 60s and 70s, schools for the deaf developed extremely complicated and intricate manuals with checklists and scope and sequences of syntax objectives. Just about all IEPs back then had long lists of syntax objectives on them. We don't see that so much anymore these days because our job seems to have changed from helping students to learn to communicate to helping them navigate communication in the general education environment. Be that as it may, deaf and hard of hearing students still struggle with syntax. And I'm not going to spend a lot of time here talking about English grammar, but I do want to make sure you have in your head the sorts of things I mean when I say syntax. And so for our purposes, I am breaking syntax down into these 5 classes of structures: basic sentence patterns, compound sentences, reconfigured sentences, complex sentences, and compound complex sentences. I'm going to give you a couple examples on the next several slides, but I'm not going to describe them in great detail. There are books and books and books written about syntax that you can read if you're looking for details. Suffice it to say that you need to know what goes into making up sentences, so when your students struggle to read English, you will know what grammar skill is tripping them up. Here are the 5 basic sentence patterns of English. I'm going to whip through each of these pretty quickly, but these patterns are the only ones that I'll go into detail about. The first basic sentence pattern includes a subject and a transitive verb. Sentences like "the baby slept," "camels spit," and "pigs can't fly" fall into this category. The second basic sentence pattern includes a transitive verb which requires a direct object. Sentences such as "Ben likes pizza," "she paid her bills," and "the boy made a mess" fall into this category. The next 3 basic sentence patterns build around a linking verb. In this, the third basic sentence pattern, the linking verb is followed by an adjective. Sentences such as "I am happy," "they were tired," and "she is friendly" are examples of this pattern. Next, the linking verb can be followed by a noun that renames the subject. In the sentence, "Helen is a hygienist," the noun Helen and the noun hygienist refer to the same thing, the same person. Other examples are "David is a dentist" or "Boo Boo is a bear." In all these cases, the first noun and the second noun refer to the same thing. Finally, the linking verb can attach the subject to an adverbial phrase, such as a prepositional phrase or adverb. Examples of this are the sentences, "Ted was in the water," "Mary was here," or "he is at home." That's it. That's all there is to the basic sentence patterns. It sounds simple, right? But in a recent study by Cannon and others comparing 49 hearing and 49 deaf and hard of hearing students, the deaf and hard of hearing students in 2nd through 6th grade were statistically significantly poorer than their hearing counterparts on their ability to read information presented via basic sentence patterns. They were not able to choose a correct picture out of 3 when they were shown the corresponding sentence. Here's an example of a task they had to do. They had to read the sentence at the bottom and point to the correct picture in a choice of 3 pictures. This is one of the easiest ones, and they did fairly well on this particular picture, but overall, the deaf and hard of hearing students did not come near a full mastery of the basic sentence patterns. No deaf and hard of hearing student in the Cannon study achieved 100% on any of the structures, although most students with typical hearing did. My point is that typically hearing children master basic grammar before they come to school, but deaf and hard of hearing children still struggle with it for many years. If they can't read sentences written in basic grammar, then how can we expect them to read sentences written in more complicated grammar? And grammar gets really complicated really fast. Here are examples of the more complicated syntax patterns. You can see that they build on the basic sentence types. Think about the students you work with. Which of these sentences would your students have difficulty with? I'll give you a minute to read these sentences and to think about your deaf and hard of hearing students. And it's not just deaf and hard of hearing kids in the U.S. who have problems. Deaf and hard of hearing readers around the English-speaking world struggle with this kind of grammar. Here is a list of many structures that are problematic for users of many languages. So now let's take a look at morphology, which is another component of grammar. We have 2 types of morphemes, Free morphemes are made up of base or root words, including prepositions such as in and on, and modals such as will and can. Bound morphemes must be tied to a base morpheme to make sense. There are two kinds of bound morphemes: inflectional morphemes and derivational morphemes. The inflectional morphemes define noun-verb agreement and verb tense, among other things. The derivational morphemes are prefixes and suffixes that change one word form, such as the verb bake, to another word form, such as the noun baker. In the canon study previously described, deaf and hard of hearing students also had statistically significantly poorer use of morphemes than typically hearing readers. In this sentence, the boy was flying the kite, we have noun-verb agreement between boy and was, and we have the inflectional morpheme ing, which we use to represent progressive tense. In fact, the kids in the canon study did even worse on inflectional morphology than they did on basic syntax. So we now have double trouble. The final piece that I'm throwing into the grammar soup is called function words. People usually think of function words as vocabulary, but they are actually more highly associated with grammar than with word meaning, especially at the phrase level. You know how challenging it is to teach vocabulary to struggling language learners and to struggling readers. Here's what puzzles me. If we have difficulty teaching content vocabulary to our kids, where you can show a picture or an image to convey the meaning, then why do we expect them to learn the harder words like the, of, and by simply by memorizing them? That's because we can't show a picture of the or a picture of. And so we just say, oh, just make them learn them by sight. In fact, function words only make sense if they are connected to something. So in order to teach them, they at least have to be placed into a connected phrase, like a box of cereal or the cute kitten. In an older study, Erie and Wills found that hearing first graders learned function words better if they were in the context of sentences than if they were just on flashcards, because content provides the image ability or the visualization of the meaning of the words that a simple list does not. In fact, depending upon the source you're consulting, sometimes you see a word in a list of morphemes. For example, on is one of the words in Roger Brown's initial list of morphemes. And sometimes you see a word in a list of function words or sight words. For example, for is a morpheme, but you also see it listed as a function word. So this makes me ponder, does it even matter if we call a morpheme or a function word? I don't think so. I think what really matters is that all of these pieces go together to make up basic phrases. And so if we want to help students read difficult grammar, maybe we should start by helping them read basic phrases. I took this example passage from an internet site that said it was a second grade passage. Let's stop here for a minute so you can think of the deaf and hard of hearing children you have worked with. Based on the syntax and morphology descriptions given, and based on your knowledge of the children you teach, what parts of this passage would give your students trouble and why? You may stop this presentation here for 5 minutes or so to do this task. Welcome back. Now let's take a look at why the grammar in this second grade reading passage is so hard. First, in this short passage, you have a complex if-then structure. if you stood on the moon. Next, you have a difficult morpheme or sight word in the phrase would look. You also have a lot of reconfiguration using there, as in there is no sound. You also have complex sentences using dependent and independent clauses, as in the sentence using because. Finally, there are a lot of function words like that, there, no, and any that make this linguistically a very complex paragraph. Remember, no deaf and hard of hearing students in the Canon study mastered all of the basic sentence patterns, let alone some of the more complex stuff. So you can see why the research has been very clear that deaf and hard of hearing children struggle with complex morphology, syntax, and function words. Part of the problem is that our kids, whether they use spoken language or sign language, struggle to have access to these little pieces of grammar. Those using spoken language may not have clear access to the quieter morphemes. Those who use ASL don't see English morphemes or function words, period. And folks who use English-like signing often drop off the morphemes and function words that glue phrases together. And so signers don't have clear access to these little grammar pieces either. But grammar is very important in reading. Word order helps activate the vocabulary and memory areas of the brain. Hearing struggling readers have difficulty with word order. Deaf and hard of hearing readers have delays in all areas associated with word order, and so it's not surprising that this would influence their reading because problems with word order go hand in hand with problems with reading comprehension. Grouping of words into phrases may be a way in which grammar links to reading comprehension in older readers. It's not only those deaf and hard of hearing readers who are trying to master spoken language who have grammar problems, but deaf and hard of hearing students learning ASL as well. The better a deaf and hard of hearing reader is in language, whether ASL or English, the better his reading comprehension. But the influence doesn't stop there. Delays in both simple and complex grammar not only influence reading, but influence writing too. When writers don't have complex grammar, their written products are fragmented. In order to help deaf and hard of hearing students improve their grammar, you will want to get a good assessment of their skills. But this is always very difficult because we have so many factors to take into consideration, including the fact that we are often working with more than one language and more than one mode. The fact is that we simply don't have really good assessments available to tell teachers what they need to do tomorrow morning with little Johnny or little Mary. If you are interested in looking at the standardized language assessments and our researcher-created assessments that we used in the CLAD project, here is how you would go to that list. Go to clad.education.gsu.edu. Click on Center Activities, then click on Information on CLAD Assessments, and then click on the 2014 Handout on Assessments. This will provide you with a list of standardized language and literacy tests. These tests will give you data that you might need for your IEPs. The tests you'll be interested in are the Language Modality Interview, the Expressive One-Word Picture Vocabulary Test, the Woodcock-Johnson Expressive Vocabulary Subtest, the Clinical Evaluation of Language Fundamentals, the Comprehensive Assessment of Spoken Language, and the ASL Receptive Test. One test that is currently under investigation is the Comprehension of Written Grammar Test, or the CWG. I referred to this work earlier in this presentation. Dr. Cannon has validated the assessment and is in the process of seeking a vendor for it. When it becomes available, we will post that on the CLAD website. In the interim, there are several good checklists you can use to do an inventory of what you know about your student's language. There's the Teacher Assessment of Grammatical Structures, which you can get from the Central Institute for the Deaf, the Teacher Assessment of Spoken Language, which you can get from the Moog Center, and the Cottage Acquisition Scales for Listening, Language, and Speech, or the CASLs, which you can get from the Sunshine Cottage for deaf children. All three of these products are inventories of morphology, syntax, and function words, and will give you a place to inventory the grammar your students use. And so this brings us to intervention. I'm sorry to say that there are no existing curriculums for morphology and syntax that have been developed specifically for deaf and hard of hearing students, and that have a strong evidence base. There are some programs that have been developed, but they have not been validated in any literature that I am aware of. These include, but are not limited to, the Language Adventure Early Childhood Curriculum for preschool through kindergarten, created by the Sunshine Cottage School for Deaf Children in San Antonio, Texas. Teaching activities for children who are deaf and hard of hearing, which is based on integration of grammar instruction into learning experiences and language experience stories from the Moog Center in St. Louis. And several products from Butte Publications, such as Basic Sentences, Basic Questions, and Lessons in Syntax. But again, none of these have been proven successful through empirical research. So you will want to use them thoughtfully and to include an action research component in your plans. We do have some research on different strategies that have been used, but they conflict with one another. Story-based interventions are one strategy, but one study says that implicit instruction during storybook reading is better, and the other study says that explicit instruction during storybook reading is better. Implicit means that the grammar rule was embedded in a story, and the children learned it experientially. Explicit means that the interventionist called the child's attention to the grammar rule directly through modeling, recasting, and having the child self-correct. Similar to storybook reading is the strategy of dialogic reading as described by Whitehurst. The researchers in this study used explicit instruction, also including modeling and recasting, but also adding in questions that would lead the child to have to use the target grammar. So these strategies seem to have a developing evidence base. As far as language interventions for school-age children, two strategies have been studied. The first is the use of a computer-based intervention in which the computer model required some children to produce the grammar, while other children did not have to produce it. Students who had to produce the target structure did better than those who didn't. So we have an accumulating set of strategies: modeling, recasting, questioning so the child embeds the target in his answers, and directly requesting the child to say the target. This sequence of strategies works with preschool children and appears to work when blended into computer-based interventions for school-age children. However, just having the child watch a computer program does not seem to have much benefit. You must also integrate the strategies of modeling, recasting, questioning, and requesting production. A final strategy with some evidence for school-age children is the metalinguistic intervention. This involves highlighting the grammar target in some usual manner, whether through coding it with color, or an arrow, or putting it into a visual organizer, or directly correcting errors in print. For example, Ebbels and van der Lely used different colors, shapes, and symbols to represent various grammatical features. Barrett and colleagues used a plus or minus designation on written language samples to show students what they did right and what they did wrong. My former PhD student, Dr. Jessica Trussell, used an adaptation of the Spelling Through Morphographs program, which required students to take apart and put words back together with a success for most students in her study. Finally, Walbers and her team have been working on the strategic and interactive writing intervention, in which they incorporate work on grammar with school-age readers and writers. You can read up on all these strategies in the articles I have identified for you. To summarize, the best strategies for teaching grammar must begin with frequent, high-quality examples from a model, whether your target is syntax or morphology. It may include both implicit and explicit instruction, but in all cases, the children who had to actually produce the targets themselves, after good modeling and teaching, of course, learned the targets better. Reinforcement is always needed in both school and at home. However, we still don't know which grammatical structures can be learned implicitly and which are best learned explicitly, so there's still a lot of work we need to do to figure out how to teach grammar. Thank you for your time and attention. I know that grammar is a very confusing topic for many people, but it is significantly related to reading comprehension. I would encourage you now to reflect on the following questions. What materials do you use to teach grammar, whether function words, morphology, or syntax? Do these materials adhere to any of the known practices described previously? And have you ever consulted with your school's speech-language pathologist to ask for ideas on teaching grammar? Thank you again for all the hard work you do on behalf of our kids.